The premium fee of $87,000 bought Elena and Jonah Delgerson a ticket to the top, but it couldn't buy them the skills to stay alive. While elite guides refused the contract, the couple pushed upward with empty oxygen tanks and frostbitten hands. The tension peaked when Elena's harness unexpectedly disengaged from the fixed rope during a chaotic rescue attempt. As she vanished over the Kangshung Face, Jonah lunged after her, unaware that his own oxygen supply had just hissed its very last breath. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. The air at 27,300 feet doesn't just feel thin, it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest, a reminder that the human body starts dying the very second it arrives in the death zone. It was the 22nd of May 2019, and the southeast ridge of Mount Everest was a frozen graveyard of ambition. Tashi Norbu stood on the fixed line, his breath coming in ragged, metallic rasps through his oxygen mask. He turned his head, the movement slow and heavy, to look back at the two figures clipped into the rope behind him. With a stiff, gloved hand, he made a sharp pushing motion, palm outward. It was a silent command that every climber should know: keep your distance. But the couple behind him, Elena and Jonah Delgerson, didn't move with the instinctive grace of mountaineers. They moved with a jerky, desperate effort that made the seasoned Sherpas on the ridge exchange uneasy glances. Elena was a 41-year-old corporate attorney from Denver who had spent just 3 months training for the most lethal peak on the planet. Her husband Jonah, a software consultant, had ticked off one of the 7 summits the year before, but Everest is a different beast entirely. They were wealthy, driven, and clearly out of their depth. Behind them, another Sherpa named Lakba Dorj watched their progress with a sinking feeling in his gut. He had been observing the Delgersons for 2 hours, noting how Elena required constant assistance on sections that even a novice should have handled alone. Lakba whispered to a colleague that he didn't think they'd even make it past the balcony. He'd seen this pattern before, and in his experience, it always ended with a body bag or a disappearance. The injustice of the situation started months earlier in the polished offices of expedition organizers. The Delgersons had been turned away by top-tier outfitters who realized they lacked the skills to survive. But money has a way of silencing warnings on Everest. They eventually found a company willing to take them for $87,000 each, a premium fee that was $12,000 above the standard rate. They weren't paying for safety. They were paying for someone to say yes when the mountain was screaming no. By the time they reached Camp 4 on May 21st, they were already 2 hours behind the rest of the pack. While other teams were hydrating and checking gear, the Delgersons were just stumbling into their tents at 4:30 p.m., exhausted before the real climb had even begun. That evening, their equipment was inspected twice, which is unusual. The first check was routine, but the second was performed by Karma Dawa, a senior guide with 21 summits under his belt, who had been asked by a concerned Sherpa to take a look at the Americans. Karma confirmed the oxygen masks and regulators were working, but he knew the gear wasn't the problem. He called it a movement problem. He had actually refused to guide the couple earlier in the season during acclimatization because he could see they didn't have the experience. Yet, here they were, clipped into the line in the middle of the night, headed for a summit that didn't care about their bank accounts. The first steep section above camp was a 40-degree slope of hard ice over unforgiving rock. It required the use of a jumar, a mechanical ascender that slides up the rope but locks tight if you fall. For an experienced climber, clipping and unclipping a jumar is like breathing. It's automatic, even in the freezing dark. But within the first 30 minutes, Elena was fumbling. A climber behind her watched in disbelief as she struggled with the carabiner gate for over a minute until Tashi had to climb back down the rope to fix it for her. It was a tiny delay, a small mechanical hiccup, but at that altitude, every lost minute is a drop of life being drained away. As the sun began to hint at the horizon, the couple's pace slowed to a crawl. Jonah kept stopping to pull an insulated camera out of his chest pouch to take photos of the line of climbers. Every time he stopped, a gap formed in the rope, and the frustrated climbers behind him had to wait, their toes numbing in the shadows. By 2:30 a.m., they were at 27,000 feet, and Elena's pace was so slow that a Spanish climber nearby estimated they were moving at half the speed of a normal summit push. He noticed something else chilling. Elena's oxygen mask was fogging internally every time her headlamp caught it. It was a sign of a bad seal or heavy, panicked breathing. Tashi saw it too, but he didn't stop to fix it. On the fixed line, stopping creates a bottleneck, a dangerous congestion that Sherpas try to avoid unless it's a life-or-death emergency. By the time they reached the balcony, over 40 climbers were crowded into the small resting area. Tashi crouched next to the Delgersons, his movements urgent. A German guide named Andreas Müller later claimed he heard Tashi telling the couple they were too slow and that they had reached their turnaround time. It was the moment of truth, the final exit ramp before the ridge becomes a one-way street to the summit. But the Delgersons didn't turn around. They didn't argue. They just looked at Tashi and then back at the summit. Tenzin Funsock, another Sherpa resting nearby, watched as they clipped back onto the rope and continued upward. He later told investigators that while they should have descended, they had paid to go up, and it was the Sherpa's job to take them. It was the ultimate trap, the client's ego fueled by the guide's financial need for a successful summit tip. As they moved off the balcony, their oxygen logs told the story their faces couldn't. Standard protocol says you should have 2/3 of your supply left at this point. Elena had 55%. Jonah had 52%. They were already burning through their reserves, and they still had the most grueling part of the climb ahead of them. For an elite mountaineer, climbing without oxygen is a feat. For the Delgersons, it was a death sentence. They were about to enter a world where their cognitive and physical functions would crumble in minutes without that gas. Tashi carried one spare bottle, a standard backup for a guide, but a single bottle isn't enough for two people who are already running on empty. The ridge was waiting, and the mountain was about to collect its debt. The climb between the balcony and the south summit is where the mountain stops being a challenge and starts being an executioner. The route transitions into a steep ridge of mixed rock and ice, with the angle sharpening to nearly 50 degrees in sections. For the Delgersons, every step was a battle against a nervous system that was beginning to misfire. The physical effort required to pull oneself upward using an ascender at that altitude is immense, and by 5:30 a.m., the couple hit a wall, literally. The rope line stopped entirely as bottleneck conditions developed, with too many climbers vying for the same narrow path during a rare weather window. For 40 minutes, the line didn't budge. In the world below, 40 minutes is a lunch break. At 28,000 feet, it is an eternity in a deep freezer. Multiple climbers noticed Elena leaning heavily on the fixed rope, her knees locked in a rigid, unnatural stance that suggested her leg muscles were no longer firing. She was a statue in a red-down suit, her head slumped against her chest. To make matters worse, she did something that seasoned guides call a death sentence. She pulled off her right glove to adjust her fogged oxygen mask. A climber directly behind her, Raj Patel, watched in horror as her bare hand was exposed to the negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit air, and a wind chill that made it feel much colder. By the time she finally fumbled her glove back on, her fingers were stiff and waxy, and she could barely grip her trekking pole, the first unmistakable signs of frostbite. When the line finally began to move again at 6:10 a.m., Jonah climbed close behind her, periodically reaching forward to touch her pack, as if trying to push her forward or offer a silent prayer. No words were exchanged. They were both beyond the luxury of speech. At 28,400 feet, the gamble turned into a catastrophe. Elena's legs buckled completely. She didn't fall off the mountain. Her harness and Jumar kept her tethered to the lifeline, but she folded onto the ice, her upper body slumping forward into the freezing mud of the ridge. Jonah lunged forward, grabbing her harness with both hands, trying to haul her upright, but she was dead weight. Tashi, who had been 20 feet ahead, saw the collapse and had to perform the dangerous task of down-climbing the fixed rope to reach her. He reached Elena within 2 minutes, joined by another Sherpa from a different team who unclipped from his own position to assist. Elena's eyes were open, but they were glass. She was looking through them, not with them. Her breathing was a shallow fog hitting the inside of her mask. but her limbs were limp, a classic presentation of severe hypoxia, where the brain begins to shut down non-essential functions to stay alive. Tashi grabbed her oxygen regulator and checked the gauge. The bottle was bone dry. It took 3 minutes for Tashi to swap her empty bottle for his only spare. Once the flow of life-saving gas was confirmed, he and Jonah managed to get her back on her feet, but she was swaying like a reed in the wind. Tashi pulled out his radio, trying to reach base camp or a higher team, but the transmission was a mess of static and broken fragments. He managed to blurt out a single message. A client was down at 28,400 feet, and he needed help. But here is where the commercial trap closed shut. No descent order was issued. There was no clear authority on the mountain to tell Tashi to turn around, and base camp had no real-time visibility of just how far gone Elena truly was. The decision rested on Tashi, a man hired to deliver a summit, and the Delgersons, who were no longer capable of rational thought. Tashi made the controversial assessment that she could continue with assistance. He stayed within arm's reach, watching her with a conflicted expression, looking up toward the peak that was now only 600 feet away, then back at the woman who could barely stand. Frustrated climbers pushed past them, complaining about the delay, while Tashi remained paralyzed by the pressure. When a climber asked him point-blank if he was taking them down, Tashi's response was a chilling testament to the power of the client. She wants to go up. The line began to move again, progress measured in agonizing inches. It would take 3 hours to cover the final distance at this pace, but they only made it 30 minutes before Elena stopped for good. She was still standing, still clipped in, but her mind had left the mountain. Tashi checked her oxygen again. The spare bottle he'd given her was nearly empty, and there were no more spares within reach. Jonah began to scream, a muffled, desperate sound behind his mask that the wind tried to swallow. Tashi placed both hands on Jonah's shoulders, their faces inches apart, trying to talk sense into a man who was watching his wife disappear in front of him. For 30 seconds, they stood locked together in a silent battle of wills, before Jonah finally stopped shouting and wrapped both arms around Elena to hold her upright. Other climbers began to bypass the tragedy, stepping over the rope and around the dying couple. Dawa, a Sherpa from another team, offered to help bring her down, but Tashi told him the truth. Jonah was refusing to descend. They were standing on the edge of the world, anchored to a dead dream, and the mountain was about to take its final payment. At 10:20 a.m., the mountain finally broke Elena Delgerson. Her legs buckled a second time, but this time there was no swaying, no fighting back. She dropped to her knees and slumped sideways, her entire body weight hanging from the fixed rope. She was unconscious, drifting into the final stages of a life-ending hypoxia. Tashi grabbed his radio and broadcasted a desperate plea on the emergency channel. Within 15 minutes, 2 more Sherpas, Lakpa and Nima Dorj, descended to help, but the task they faced was a structural nightmare. The fixed ropes on Everest are designed for upward progress, not for lowering a dead-weight human being through a vertical funnel. Over 20 grueling minutes, the 4 men managed to move her just 30 feet downward. They were exhausted, their own oxygen supply screaming at them, when a 40-mile-per-hour gust of wind slammed into the ridge. The blast staggered the standing men and caused Elena's suspended body to swing violently sideways. Then, the impossible happened. Elena's Jumar, the mechanical ascender that was her only connection to life, disengaged from the fixed rope. Whether the lateral force of the wind had twisted the cam or the gate hadn't been fully closed in the earlier chaos remains a debate, but the result was immediate. Her body dropped, the weight snapping the backup carabiner as she began to slide across the 50-degree ice slope. She accelerated in seconds, rotating as she moved, until she disappeared over a ridge break. She fell into the Kangshung Face, a vertical wall that drops 10,000 feet toward Tibet. There was no impact, no sound, just empty air where a woman had been seconds before. Jonah stood frozen, staring at the empty patch of ice for several seconds before the silence was shattered by his screaming. The sound was so raw it could be heard even over the howling wind. He lunged toward the edge where his wife had vanished, and it took Tashi and Lakpa physically tackling him to keep him from unclipping and following her down. They held him until his struggle turned into a rigid, hollow stare. Tashi checked Jonah's gauge. His bottle was empty. In a final, futile act of loyalty, Tashi removed his own mask and connected his remaining 40% of oxygen to Jonah's regulator. Jonah didn't even notice. He stood facing the edge, his shoulders slowly slumping as the last of Tashi's oxygen hissed into his lungs. By 11:15, that bottle ran dry, too. As the oxygen left him, the rigid posture of the grieving husband dissolved. His knees bent, his head dropped to his chest, and at 11:50, he slumped against the rope in a sitting position. Tashi reached for a pulse, but found only the cold stillness of the death zone. Nima Dorj arrived 20 minutes later with fresh bottles, but there was no one left to breathe them. For 6 hours, Jonah's body remained clipped to the main climbing route, a silent obstacle that dozens of exhausted climbers had to step around as they descended. It wasn't until 6 p.m. that a recovery team managed to move him to a sheltered area 200 feet below the route. 3 days later, he was flown to Kathmandu, but Elena was never found. The Kangshung Face is too dangerous for any recovery mission to ever attempt. The official inquiries eventually cleared the guiding company, stating that all technical protocols had been met, but the documents never answered the real question: why were they there in the first place? The legacy of the Delgersons is a chilling reminder of the commercial trap at the top of the world, where an $87,000 permit can buy you a ticket to the summit, but it can't buy you the skills to survive the descent. The mountain doesn't care about the premium you paid. It only cares about the air you have left. If you're gripped by the reality of what happens when ambition meets the unforgiving laws of the death zone, hit the like button and subscribe. We explore the high-stakes decisions that separate survival from tragedy. Do you think the expedition company should have forced a descent? Or is the ultimate responsibility always on the climber? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Disclaimer: this program is for entertainment purposes only. While the narrative is based on documented reports and witness statements regarding the 2019 Everest expedition of Elena and Jonah Delgerson, certain scenes and dialogue have been dramatized for storytelling impact. This production is not intended as a technical manual for mountaineering, nor as an official legal record. High-altitude climbing is inherently dangerous. All viewers should seek professional training and certification before attempting such activities.